I am Miller Files, and every time I open a cold case, I feel the weight of a life that has slipped through the cracks of time. Some cases come with bodies, some come with confessions, and some enter the record with a single haunting truth. The victim is gone without a trace. The case of Tara Grinstead belongs to the last category, and that is what makes it one of the most challenging investigations ever documented in a small American town. The night of October 22nd, 2005, was not supposed to be anything extraordinary in Ocilla, Georgia. It was the kind of evening the town had seen 1,000 times before. The air was cool, the streets quiet, and the porch lights glowed softly over trimmed lawns and familiar houses. Nothing suggested that this night would become the beginning of a mystery lasting more than a decade. The truth is that evil rarely announces itself. Tara attended a small Halloween gathering hosted by close friends. They described her as radiant, cheerful, and energetic, a woman who always carried the hopes of others on her shoulders. She left the party around 11 o'clock at night. That was the last verified moment anyone saw her alive. When she drove home, there was no argument, no threat, no shadowy figure lurking behind her. The world around her was calm, almost too calm. What makes a disappearance so unsettling is the sudden silence that follows. When Tara did not show up for work the next morning, her colleagues felt something was wrong immediately. She was reliable, disciplined, and devoted to her students. She never missed class without warning. Her coworker stopped by her house, saw her car parked as usual, and felt the uneasy stillness in the air. Inside, lights were still on. The bedroom looked untouched. Her purse was still there. Her phone was still there. The single missing element was Tara herself. A disappearance inside one's own home is always a red flag in investigative work. Homes are sanctuaries. People do not simply walk away from them in the middle of the night. When a person vanishes without taking money or keys, we are no longer dealing with a disappearance. We are dealing with an intrusion, whether physical or psychological. I studied the early reports and felt the same tight pressure in my chest that I feel when I know something is deeply wrong. The house revealed almost nothing, and that was the most chilling part. There were no obvious signs of a struggle. A small disturbance near the door. A latex glove dropped on the ground. The kind of clues that might mean everything or might mean nothing. It is the ambiguity that tortures an investigator. If the crime scene is bloody, we know where to start. If the house is ransacked, we follow the evidence. But when the house is painfully clean, almost staged in its quietness, the investigation becomes a maze with no visible exit. In the early hours, the officers in Ocilla believed Tara might have left voluntarily. After all, she was a beloved teacher, involved deeply in the community, and sometimes highly visible people feel the pressure of expectation. But that theory dissolved quickly. Her phone was still charging. Her keys were inside. Her car had not moved an inch. The only thing missing was the person at the center of it all. For me, the first 24 hours of a disappearance serve as a mirror reflecting the truth of what happened. How the house looks, how the neighbors react, how the timeline unfolds, all of it speaks. And what the Grinstead residents whispered was not the story of a woman running away. It was the story of someone being interrupted, someone being taken, someone whose final moments did not happen by choice. Ocilla is a place where secrets do not stay buried for long. The town is too small, too intimate, too woven together for silence to go unnoticed. And yet, the silence in this case lingered like a thick fog across the streetlights. People whispered theories, speculated in grocery lines, and wondered if someone they greeted at church might know more than they were saying. When a community has no answers, fear becomes its language. I walked through Ocilla years after the disappearance, retracing Tara's final steps. I visited the small school where she taught history and coached beauty pageant contestants. Her classroom remained bright and neatly arranged. Former students told me she made them feel seen, valued, capable. A missing teacher is not like any other missing adult. A missing teacher leaves behind hundreds of young lives who suddenly feel the world is more fragile than they realized. It changes the psychology of a whole town. The more I dug into the case files, the more one truth became impossible to ignore. Tara did not simply disappear. She did not walk into the night of her own will. Her life was interrupted by someone who knew what they were doing, or someone who panicked in the worst possible way. But at this early stage, none of us knew which version it was. We only knew that time was working against us. The media quickly descended upon Ocilla. True crime reporters, investigative journalists, and television crews turned the quiet streets into a stage of national attention. Some came for answers. Others came for a story. But stories without bodies are always the hardest to tell and the hardest to solve. Without physical evidence, every theory stretches into darkness. I studied the list of individuals close to Tara. Friends, colleagues, former romantic partners, neighbors, former students. A woman as involved as Tara inevitably touches many lives, and each life she touched had the potential to become a thread in the investigation. The question was, which thread led to the truth, and which threads were harmless connections? The last calls on her phone were checked. One unanswered call stood out. A friend trying to reach her late that night. No answer, no activity past a certain time. It is the digital heartbeat stopping that tells us when the crime likely occurred. That quiet end of activity, that simple moment when a phone stops being touched by its owner, often marks the moment everything changed. But this case had something no investigator wants to see. It had a house still glowing with warm lights, as if the world inside expected its owner to return at any moment. That detail stayed with me. It felt like a snapshot of a life paused, not ended. And that makes the disappearance feel even more violent, because it means the moment Tara stepped back into her home, she had no idea she was stepping into the final moments of her life. This is where the story of the disappearance ends and the long road of the investigation begins. A road filled with dead ends, misleading clues, and years of silence that weighed on Ocilla like an invisible storm cloud. In the next chapter, I will bring you deeper into the heart of the investigation to understand how a town's secrets, fears, and whispered suspicions shaped one of the longest-running missing person cases in Georgia's modern history. This is just the beginning. The night she disappeared was merely the first shadow in a much darker story. The morning after Tara Grinstead's disappearance was the moment the investigation began to fracture into layers that would take years to separate. Missing person cases always begin with hope, but in Ocilla, the hope was thin from the start. People in small towns know each other too well. When someone like Tara vanishes, the town feels it instantly, like a sudden shift in temperature. Something unnatural has entered the air. By the end of that first day, the investigation was already carrying the weight of a case that refused to define itself. When I examine the early steps of any police inquiry, I look for rhythm. A clean investigation moves forward in lines. It forms patterns, it rejects the unnecessary, and highlights what matters. But the Grinstead case lacked rhythm. It moved in circles. The officers checked her house again and again, as if the simple act of looking might bring her back. But the house gave nothing new. It held a silence so complete that it felt unnatural, a silence almost too careful. The first interviews were conducted with neighbors. In a close-knit town like Ocilla, neighbors are not just witnesses. They are part of the social anatomy of the place. They know who drives where, who comes home late, who leaves early. But on the night Tara disappeared, no one saw anything that pointed to danger. A light on, a car parked, a porch, no cries for help, no unusual sounds. It was as though the night swallowed every clue before anyone woke up. I studied the statements and knew something was wrong. In criminal investigations, silence is loud. A violent abduction, an impulsive attack, even an argument tends to leave behind noise. But this case gave us only absence. It was as though whoever approached Tara's home had moved like a shadow, left like a shadow, and erased everything in between. That level of disappearance requires either planning or panic, and at this point in the investigation, both possibilities felt equally plausible. Tara's personal life became the next terrain of inquiry. Investigators asked about former relationships, current interests, private tensions. Any detail, no matter how small, might hold the answer. The officers focused on a few men who had shown interest in her. Small-town rumors amplified their profiles. But rumors are unreliable companions. They distract investigators with sensational details while hiding the true shape of a crime. And in this case, the rumors obscured more than they revealed. When I later walked the streets of Ocilla, I could sense the pressure that had built in those early weeks. The media had arrived. Reporters lined the sidewalks. Television vans parked outside the police station, broadcasting every new angle. With each passing day, Tara's name spread further across the country. In a town that rarely saw crime, the national spotlight felt like a foreign intrusion. It brought attention, but it also brought expectations. People wanted answers. People wanted closure. But an investigation cannot move faster than the truth. The search expanded beyond the house. Volunteers combed the woods. Helicopters scanned fields. Dogs trailed scents that evaporated into dead air. The effort was enormous, but the results were hollow. It was as though Tara had slipped into a pocket of the world where no trace of her remained. I reviewed the aerial maps, the ground searches, the interviews, and the collected evidence. Every direction felt like a road that had been walked too late. One question haunted the investigation in those early months. Why would someone target Tara? She had no known enemies. She lived a structured life. She followed routines. She cared about her students. These qualities should have made her safer, but instead, they made the case more complex. Predictability makes people vulnerable. Routines make them easy to find, and Tara's routine was known to many. The latex glove found near her home became a focal point of speculation. Investigators hoped it would hold DNA, a fingerprint, a partial print, anything. But the glove refused to cooperate. Environmental exposure had damaged any biological evidence. The glove became more of a symbol than a clue. It represented possibility, nothing more. It reminded investigators how thin their chances were becoming. In a disappearance like this, the investigation often becomes a mirror reflecting the town. And what the mirror revealed was unsettling. Fear seeped into conversations. Suspicion crept into daily life. People wondered if the person responsible was someone they knew, someone they trusted. The idea that a predator might be living among them became more plausible with each passing week. When I spoke to retired officers years later, they all shared the same confession. They felt the case slipping away from them almost immediately. They described it as trying to hold water in their hands. No matter how hard they closed their fingers, the water found a way to escape. Without physical evidence, theories multiplied faster than facts. One detective told me that he went to sleep thinking about Tara and woke up thinking about Tara, as if the case had taken residence inside his mind. Months passed. Leads dried. Witnesses repeated the same information. Investigators reviewed the same details, as if hoping that repetition might reveal a hidden thread. The case file thickened, but the evidence did not. And then came the darkest moment in any investigation, the quiet acceptance that the case was becoming cold. But cold cases do not die. They wait. They bide their time until someone, somewhere, breaks. Sometimes it is the perpetrator. Sometimes it is an accomplice. Sometimes it is a witness whose conscience has been eroding for years. And sometimes it is a person who had nothing to do with the crime, but knows something that others do not. When a secret is carried by more than one person, it cannot last forever. In these early years, the police did not know who held the secret. They only knew the truth was buried behind a wall of silence. Every person interviewed might have been the key or might have been entirely innocent. This is the torture of working a missing person case with no body. Without the physical presence of the victim, the story remains incomplete. Without a body, there is no timeline, no cause of death, no definitive crime. As I reconstructed these early phases of the investigation, I felt the slow disintegration of certainty that the officers must have felt. Every disappearance has a center, a point where the story begins. But the center of Tara's disappearance felt hollow. It contained nothing, and nothing is the hardest thing to pursue. Still, the investigators continued because that is what duty demands. They followed every lead, no matter how unlikely. They questioned every person who might have had any interaction with her. They revisited her workplace, her routines, her habits. They studied her phone records. They looked for patterns. They found none. What they did not know, what they could not know at the time, was that the truth was not waiting in the woods, nor in the fields, nor in the rivers around Ocilla. The truth was walking among them, shaking their hands, shopping in their stores, attending local events. The truth was part of the community, not separate from it, and that fact would only surface more than a decade later. The disappearance of Tara Grinstead was no longer just a missing person case. It had become a shadow over Ocilla, a presence felt in every conversation and every household. And as the first year passed with no answers, the shadow only grew darker. What the investigators did not yet realize was that they were searching in the wrong direction. The person involved in Tara's disappearance was closer than anyone imagined, hidden in plain sight. The investigation had lost its shape, and when an investigation loses its shape, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a haunting. In the next chapter, I will take you deeper into how a town's silence, fear, and fractured truths shape the long path toward uncovering what really happened to Tara Grinstead. This is where the case shifts from a search for a missing woman to a search for the hidden architecture of a crime that no one wanted to believe could happen in their town. This is where the real shadows begin. There comes a point in every cold case when the investigation stops being about evidence and begins being about people. In Ocilla, that shift happened gradually, almost invisibly, until the case was no longer a hunt for physical clues, but a deep study of human behavior. When a woman disappears without a trace, the silence she leaves behind becomes a kind of language. And in this town, It was a language of whispers. I remember the first time I drove through Ocilla during my independent review of the files. The town had the look of a place suspended in time. The streets were clean, the porches were swept, and the same storefronts that existed the day Tara disappeared were still standing. Yet beneath that familiar surface, something else existed, something that felt tight, constrained, like a story that had never been allowed to finish its sentence. People told me Tara was the light of the community, but what they didn't say out loud was that her disappearance had dimmed something inside the town itself. A missing person case does not end with the disappearance. It continues shaping the psychology of everyone who lives through it. It changes how people speak to each other, how they look at their neighbors, how they interpret the past. It creates suspicion where there was once trust, and in Ocilla, that suspicion grew in slow, quiet waves. I met former students who still looked shaken when they spoke her name. I met parents who said their children slept with the lights on for months after the news broke. I met residents who kept their porch lights on permanently, even a decade later, because turning them off felt like admitting defeat. A disappearance, especially one as unexplainable as Tara's, becomes a shadow that stretches across generations. When investigators began looking into her personal connections, they entered a web of relationships that seemed ordinary but felt increasingly connected to the case. Tara was loved, admired, and respected, but visibility can be dangerous. A person who shines brightly becomes a landmark, easy to locate, easy to approach, and sometimes too easy to follow. The officers interviewed local men who had shown interest in her, including former romantic partners and acquaintances. None of them offered a clear path. Each provided alibis that checked out, stories that aligned with the physical evidence, which was almost non-existent. The investigation wandered through these early theories, like a traveler lost in dense fog, feeling shapes, but touching nothing real. One of the officers told me years later that Ocilla felt like a library where every book refused to open. People answered questions, but not fully. They offered information, but only what everyone already knew. There was a strange duality at play. The town wanted the case solved, yet it also seemed to fear what the answer might reveal. Rumors began to swirl, as they always do in environments where fear and uncertainty coexist. Theories that had no evidence attached themselves to the narrative. Some said Tara had run away to escape pressures no one knew about. Others invented secret relationships or hidden dangers. The truth is that people create stories when silence becomes unbearable. They fill the void with whatever feels plausible or dramatic or comforting. But none of those stories match the reality buried deep beneath the surface of this case. I remember examining the timeline again and again, looking for cracks. The night she returned home was too quiet, too controlled, too deliberate. It felt like the work of someone who knew her routines, someone who understood when she would be alone, someone who approached her house with intention. But intention alone does not make a murderer. Panic does, impulse does. And the more I studied the early patterns, the more I sensed that this was not the work of a seasoned predator. It was the work of someone who acted out of a sudden, catastrophic moment. But catastrophic moments do not last forever. They fade, and when they fade, guilt begins its long, slow erosion. It eats at the mind. It hollows out the conscience. It makes sleep impossible. In a small town, guilt does not just affect the guilty. It spreads like a quiet sickness, infecting everyone who suspects something, knows something, or fears something. And Ocilla was sick with guilt for years. I walked through the wooded areas where volunteers had searched. I visited the fields where helicopters had hovered. I retraced the paths of cadaver dogs whose noses found nothing. In every place, I felt the weight of missed opportunities, not because investigators made the wrong choices, but because the truth was never in the places they looked. The truth was living among them, blending in, waiting for the world to stop asking questions. There was one statement in the early reports that stayed with me. A neighbor described hearing nothing unusual the night Tara disappeared. But she added something else before ending the interview. She said the town felt different the next morning, as if the air itself had changed. She said it felt heavier, more distant, as if the world had been split into before and after, even though no one understood why. I knew what she meant. Some crimes change the atmosphere of a place. They bend reality in subtle ways. They turn familiar streets into reminders of unanswered questions. The Grinstead case wrapped Ocilla in a blanket of dread that never quite lifted. And yet the truth remained hidden because the people who held that truth were not strangers. They were not passers-by. They were sons of the community, young men who grew up on those same streets, attended the same school, walked the same hallways where Tara taught. They were not outsiders invading the town. They were insiders who became the architects of its darkest secret. But at this stage of the investigation, no one knew that. Not the officers, not the residents, not Tara's family, and not the country watching the case unfold on national television. All anyone knew was that a beloved teacher had vanished, and the world around her had turned into a labyrinth. Whenever I analyze a case like this, I remind myself that truth rarely hides in shadows. It hides in familiarity. It hides in the places that seem least suspicious. It hides behind faces that appear harmless. And in this case, it hid for more than a decade behind the faces of two young men who carried a secret too heavy for either of them to bear. The whispers in town grew louder year after year. People sensed something was wrong, even if they could not name it. And when whispers grow loud enough, they eventually become unbearable for the people who know the truth. That is when secrets begin to crack. And the cracks finally appeared in 2017, after 12 long years of silence. But before the confession came, before the names were revealed, before the truth crawled out of the darkness, Ocilla endured a period of suspicion and fear so intense that it reshaped the town's identity. This was the era when every neighbor wondered about every neighbor. This was the era when silence spoke louder than words. This was the era just before the fall of the secret. In the next chapter, I will tell you what finally cracked the wall of silence. I will bring you into the moment when the truth first surfaced, and how the story of Tara Grinstead moved from a haunting mystery to a chilling confession. The whispers were ending, and the truth was coming. In every investigation, especially in a cold case stretched thin by years of uncertainty, there comes a moment when silence begins to fracture. It never happens loudly. It never comes with warning. It arrives quietly, like a fault line opening beneath the surface. And in the case of Tara Grinstead, that fracture appeared in the year 2017, long after the world had stopped expecting answers. I remember the day the tip came in. It did not sound extraordinary. It did not come from an experienced investigator or a major witness. It came from someone who had carried a story too heavy for too long, a story he could no longer silence, and the name he spoke would become the key that unlocked everything. Ryan Duke. Before this moment, Ryan's name barely existed in the case file. He was not among the early suspects. He was not someone who had raised suspicion. He was a former student of Tara's, one of many young men who had passed through her classroom. The file showed almost nothing about him, which in retrospect made perfect sense. Sometimes, the most dangerous truths are the ones hiding in plain sight, unremarkable and unremembered, until the moment they can no longer stay buried. When investigators brought him in for questioning, the air in the interview room changed. Those who were there described it as a subtle but unmistakable shift, the feeling that the truth was sitting in the room before anyone even spoke. For 12 years the case had lived in a haze of uncertainty, but as Ryan sat down, something about the silence felt different. It felt anticipatory. It felt like the moment before a storm breaks. The confession came quickly, not because of skillful interrogation, not because of pressure, but because he was exhausted. The weight of silence had worn him down. He told investigators he had entered Tara's house the night she disappeared. His voice trembled as he explained that it was not premeditated, not planned, not driven by hatred or intent. It was driven by desperation. He said he went there to steal money, a simple act of theft that spiraled into tragedy. He described Tara confronting him. He described the panic that seized him. He described the terrible moment when panic became violence. What he said next changed everything. He admitted to causing her death, not intentionally, he insisted, not with purpose, but with a single catastrophic decision from which there was no return. He thought the worst was over, but it had only begun. He spoke of calling a friend, someone he trusted, someone he believed would help him. And that friend, whose name echoed through the investigation like an unexpected chord, was Bo Dukes. Bo did not have the same cautious demeanor as Ryan. Unlike Ryan, who appeared hollowed out by years of guilt, Bo carried himself with a kind of reckless confidence. As investigators interviewed him, the picture of what had happened to Tara became clearer, darker, and far more disturbing than anyone imagined. Bo admitted to helping Ryan move Tara's body. He admitted to transporting her to a remote family property. He admitted to participating in the act that erased any chance of finding her remains intact. He spoke about the fire, the heat, the days spent returning to the site, the effort to make sure nothing remained, the deliberate attempt to erase a life. When I later walked the perimeter of that land, the soil looked no different from any other Georgia farmland, but I could feel the history beneath my feet. The story of what had been done there did not linger in visible clues. It lingered in the atmosphere. A place can absorb the trauma of an event, even when nothing remains above the surface. What struck me most was how ordinary these men were, not monsters in the traditional sense, not seasoned criminals or shadowy figures. They were young men from the same community as Tara, raised in the same streets, taught in the same school. This was the kind of crime that defies expectation. It does not come from evil intent, but from the terrible combination of impulse, fear, and the inability to face consequences. When the arrests were announced, Ocilla seemed to stop breathing. Residents who had lived under the weight of uncertainty for 12 years now confronted an entirely different burden. The realization that the truth had been beside them the whole time. People who once feared an outsider now realized the tragedy came from within their own community, a neighbor, a former student, a familiar face. Families who had whispered theories for years now found themselves grieving anew. Some felt relief, some felt relief, some felt disbelief. Many felt betrayed. In small towns, the idea that one of your own could commit such an act feels like a wound to the identity of the place itself. The news spread across the country. Reporters returned to Ocilla, now chasing not the mystery, but the revelation. Cameras followed every statement, every arraignment, every courtroom entry. But no headline could capture the true complexity of what had happened. This was not simply a solved crime. It was a story of silence, fear, guilt, and a secret shared between two young men who had no idea how to carry it. Ryan's confession ended the mystery, but it did not end the sorrow. The truth, once spoken, did not bring Tara back. It did not give her family the chance to bury her. It did not erase the years of not knowing. It simply provided the shape of a story everyone had been chasing in the dark. A story that now felt both too simple and too devastating. As I reviewed the final phase of the investigation, a question lingered in my mind. Did the truth emerge because someone finally felt guilt, or because the silence had become too heavy to bear? Sometimes the answer is both. Secrets are living things. They grow, they constrict, they suffocate, and eventually they break. The truth had finally broken free. In the next and final chapter, I will guide you through the aftermath of the revelations, the trials, the consequences, the emotional landscape of a town forever altered, and the lingering echo that refuses to fade even after justice has been served. The secret had cracked, but the wound it left behind had only begun to show. Some cases end with a final report, a signed document, a courtroom verdict, or a quiet conclusion written into the archive of solved mysteries. But the case of Tara Grinstead never offered that kind of ending. It did not close. It did not fade. It did not surrender its weight to the passing of time. Even after the truth surfaced and the guilty were named, the story continued to echo through Ocilla like a sound trapped between the past and the present. And as I, Miller Files, looked at the final shape of this investigation, I realized that some truths arrived too late to bring peace. When the confessions became public, the atmosphere in Ocilla shifted again, but not in the way people expected. For 12 years, the town had lived under the tension of uncertainty. They had imagined every possibility, constructed every theory, and feared every shadow. But when the truth finally emerged, the relief was incomplete. Instead of clarity, the town confronted a different kind of pain, the knowledge that the tragedy was born from within, not from an outsider. The threat they imagined for years had not come from the darkness outside their homes, but from the familiar light inside them. I attended the hearings that followed. Ryan Duke entered the courtroom looking like a man who had aged decades in silence. His shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the floor. His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had lived too long under the pressure of a secret that was never meant to be held. Bo Dukes, on the other hand, appeared with a posture that tried to mask the gravity of his role, but even he could not escape the weight of what the court and the community saw in him. Together, they formed the tragic structure of a mistake that had grown into a nightmare. The prosecutors read through the events step by step, the entry into Tara's home, the confrontation, the panic, the death, the call for help, the transport of her body, the fire, the multiple returns to ensure nothing remained. As each detail was spoken aloud, the courtroom absorbed the horror that had been hidden for more than a decade. Family members cried quietly. Former students trembled. Residents looked at each other with expressions that held both disbelief and sorrow. And in the midst of that atmosphere, I felt the familiar sensation that arrives whenever a truth is revealed too late. It was not justice. It was a wound reopening. The verdicts eventually came. Sentences were handed down. Accountability, in the legal sense, was achieved. But justice is more than punishment. Justice is the restoration of what was taken. And in this case, what was taken could not be restored. A life was gone. A family was left without a body to bury. A town was left with a story that reshaped its identity. The law could assign consequences, but it could not repair the fractures that ran through hearts, memories, and the collective spirit of Ocilla. Sometime after the trial, I returned to Tara's house one last time. It looked unchanged, as if time had preserved it out of respect. The porch still held the same quiet stillness. The windows still reflected the same Georgia sun. But the house was no longer simply a home. It had become a monument of absence, a place where a life was interrupted so suddenly that the air still felt suspended in that moment. Standing inside, I felt the echo of what had happened, not in sound, but in the way the light settled on the walls, in the way the floors seemed to hold their breath, in the way every room felt like a memory trapped in its final frame. This case taught me something I had sensed in other investigations, but never felt as profoundly as I did here. Truth does not always free people. Sometimes it binds them to a new understanding of loss. Sometimes it redefines their history. Sometimes it reveals not the darkness of strangers, but the fragility of the people we think we know. And sometimes the truth only confirms what fear has whispered for years. The people of Ocilla now live with a chapter in their history that will not disappear. Children who once learned in Tara's classroom have grown into adults who still carry her memory. Parents who once trusted the safety of their neighborhood now recall the moment they realized danger came from within. And the young men whose actions ignited this tragedy will forever be remembered, not for their lives, but for their silence, their panic, and the irreversible consequences of their choices. In the quiet moments of reflection, I often think of Tara not as a victim, but as a person whose life touched countless others, a teacher whose encouragement shaped young minds, a woman whose warmth created community, a light that never should have been extinguished. The tragedy lies not only in her death, but in the years of uncertainty that followed, a void that grew larger each day she remained missing. As I close this final chapter, I do not feel the satisfaction of a case solved. I feel the lingering echo of a story that will continue to resonate long after the names fade from headlines. Some cases do not end because endings imply closure. This story has no closure, only truth, only memory, only the echo, and that echo will never fade. This is Miller Files, and this is where I leave the story, knowing it will continue to live in the air of Ocilla, in the hearts of those who loved her, and in the shadows of every unanswered question that still drifts through the town she once called home.